fisherman pulled a coffin from the water. But what he found inside made him cry. Subscribe, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. The sea had always been both a companion and a tormentor to Calvin Harper. After years in the Navy, its voice still lived in his mind. The steady roll of waves against steel hulls, the low rumble of engines beneath his feet, the wind that carried salt into his lungs until it became part of him. Now, years later, long removed from uniform and duty, it was the same ocean that defined his days, though in quieter, lonelier ways. He lived in a small weather-worn shack on the edge of the North Carolina coast, surrounded by the sigh of pines and the endless rhythm of the tide. Fishing was his livelihood and his ritual, his anchor in a life that had lost too many connections to time and distance. He was 63, his body still broad-shouldered, though lined with the marks of age and salt, his hands calloused and scarred from years of both war and work. That evening had been different. The sky over the Atlantic had darkened too quickly, the air heavy and electric, carrying the ominous scent of rain and brine. By the time Calvin hauled in his last net, the wind was screaming across the water, pushing walls of foam and spray toward shore. Most men would have headed back hours ago, but Calvin stayed out longer than he should have. It wasn't recklessness exactly, just that same stubborn instinct he'd carried all his life, the refusal to let weather dictate his terms. Besides, he had seen worse. By the time he guided his boat into the narrow channel that led home, the world around him had become a haze of rain and shadow. Lightning fractured the sky above the water like jagged glass, lighting up the shoreline just long enough for him to glimpse the ghostly silhouettes of dunes and the skeletal outline of his dock. He fought the helm, muscles burning, and cursed under his breath when a wave slapped the bow hard enough to send icy spray over his jacket. His shoulders ached as he worked the throttle, coaxing the small craft towards the dim glow of the lantern he'd left hanging by his pier hours earlier. When at last he tied the boat off and climbed onto the slick planks, he was soaked through, hair plastered to his head, salt stinging his eyes. The storm roared on through the night, rattling the windows of his shack and howling through the trees until sleep became impossible. He sat instead in his old armchair, listening to the relentless rain hammer against the roof, the sound so deep and steady it felt like a pulse. Morning came pale and cold. The world washed clean but battered. The sand was littered with seaweed and broken driftwood, and the water near the shore still churned with the remnants of the storm's fury. Calvin stepped out into the gray light, his boots sinking in the wet ground, and surveyed the aftermath as he had 100 times before. It was a habit. Storms often dragged strange things onto shore, things forgotten or abandoned, the ocean's way of reminding people who truly ruled these coasts. It was then, as he scanned the water beyond the rocks at the edge of the inlet, that he saw it. At first, he thought it was debris from some fishing vessel, a crate, maybe, or the hull of a dinghy overturned by the storm. But even at a distance it seemed wrong, too symmetrical, too deliberate in its shape. It lay half-submerged in the shallows, caught against the jagged outcropping that marked the entrance to the small cove. The tide lapped against it gently now, revealing hints of something dark and metallic beneath a crust of barnacles and seaweed. Curiosity took hold before caution could speak. He grabbed a coil of rope, secured it to his waist, and waded into the frigid water, feeling the surge of the current tugging at his legs. The object loomed larger as he drew near, and his heart gave an involuntary thump against his ribs. It was no crate. The surface was smooth beneath his gloved hand, corroded but intact, the edges curved in a way that mimicked the outline of a human form. He froze, breath fogging in the cool air, his mind momentarily blank. It was a coffin. Not the wooden kind he'd seen lowered into earth at funerals. This was heavier, older, forged of some dark metal streaked green from corrosion, its surface engraved with patterns worn nearly invisible by time. He could see bolts sealed along its rim, thick and solid, each fused with rust. It was longer than he was tall and startlingly narrow at the shoulders and feet, tapering like an ancient sarcophagus. The sight made him shiver despite himself. With effort, he looped the rope beneath it, bracing against the rocks as he strained to free it from the grip of the tide. His muscles screamed, but slowly, inch by inch, it came loose, scraping against stone until it floated free for a brief moment before he hauled it toward shore. By the time he dragged it above the waterline, chest heaving and arms numb with exhaustion, his shirt was soaked again in cold salt water and sweat. He stood over it for a long time, staring. The coffin looked impossibly old, yet impossibly intact, as if it had been waiting in the dark for someone to find it. Barnacles clung to its sides like pale scars, and the engraved patterns, faint but visible now, spoke of another age entirely. Near the center was a circular emblem, unrecognizable beneath the corrosion but still deliberate in its design. His fingers traced it absently, and he wondered how many storms and tides it had endured before ending up here. Calvin dragged it to the weathered planks of his dock with the help of a battered winch he hadn't used in years. It groaned and creaked beneath the weight, but finally the coffin rested there, gleaming dully in the weak daylight like something out of a dream he couldn't shake. He didn't open it. Not yet. He stood for a while longer, staring at it in silence as gulls circled overhead and the wind carried the scent of brine and pine through the air. His gut twisted between fascination and unease, a sailor's instinct whispering that some things found at sea were best left untouched. But that night, lying in bed as the waves murmured beyond his window, he knew he wouldn't be able to leave it alone. The image of it haunted him, pulling at a thread of curiosity he couldn't ignore. What lay inside a coffin like that, sealed in metal and lost for who knew how long? Treasure? Bones? History itself? As the moon rose over the restless Atlantic, Calvin Harper stared at the dark silhouette of the coffin from his window, its outline stark against the pier. He didn't realize it yet, but his life, quiet, solitary, unremarkable, was about to change forever. The morning broke damp and heavy with fog, rolling in from the sea like a curtain and swallowing the horizon. Calvin rose early, as he always did, though this time it wasn't the familiar rhythm of his fisherman's routine that drew him from bed. His thoughts had circled endlessly through the night, drifting back again and again to the thing that now sat silent and imposing at the end of his dock. Every creak of the wood outside, every whisper of wind against the windows had reminded him that it was there, waiting, as though it had been delivered by the ocean itself solely for him. He dressed in silence, pulling on his heavy boots and work jacket, his hands moving automatically even as his mind was elsewhere. When he stepped outside, the world was hushed, muffled by the thick fog that clung to the water and blurred the lines of land and sky. The coffin sat precisely where he'd left it, the metal dark and slick with condensation, as though it had breathed in the night air. The barnacles clinging to it seemed even starker in the diffuse gray light, and the corrosion along its surface glimmered faintly. Calvin approached slowly, the wooden planks of the pier groaning beneath his steps. He crouched down, running his hand along its length, tracing the faint grooves in the metalwork. It was then, as he cleared away more of the clinging sea growth with a stiff bristled brush, that he noticed something unusual. Near the top, just above what would have been where the head lay, a series of shallow engravings emerged from beneath layers of grime and time. Letters, barely discernible, but letters nonetheless. He scrubbed more vigorously, heart quickening with each pass until the inscription revealed itself. HCW, it read, the initials etched in careful, old-fashioned script. Below them was an emblem, circular, divided into quadrants, though much of it was too worn to decipher. Calvin leaned back on his heels, staring at it, a flicker of recognition tugging at him, though he couldn't place it. The style of the letters was archaic, 19th century at the latest, and something about the emblem seemed faintly military, though he wasn't certain. He felt the same stirring in his gut that he'd known in the service, the moment when instinct warned of something larger beneath the surface than what the eye could see. He fetched his tools from the shed, a crowbar, a mallet, and his old portable grinder from years ago when he had patched his own boat hulls. The bolts along the coffin's rim were fused with rust, thick heads protruding like stubborn iron teeth. It would not open easily, but that only made him more determined. He had faced tougher steel in his time. He set to work methodically, his breath clouding in the cool morning air, the rhythmic rasp of metal tools echoing across the cove. Hours passed in slow, grueling labor. He struck and pried, worked the grinder where he could, sending up brief flares of orange sparks that hissed in the damp air. The smell of scorched salt and rust filled his nostrils. Sweat rolled down his back despite the chill, soaking through his shirt beneath his jacket. The bolts resisted like they were holding back the weight of time itself. During a pause to rest his aching shoulders, Calvin sat back and studied the coffin once more. His gaze drifted again to the initials, HCW. He muttered them aloud under his breath, tasting the unfamiliar combination of letters. He had heard stories growing up of old Southern families along this coast, names that had faded from memory as the tides erased their estates and history swallowed their fortunes. Could it be one of them? He thought of his grandfather's tales, told in the quiet evenings of his youth, about ships that had vanished in storms, about whispered legends of gold meant to fund a rebellion that never reached its destination. He had never put much stock in those stories, chalking them up to fireside embellishments passed down by men who had nothing but time and memory. But now, staring at this impossible artifact dragged from the deep, those old words no longer seemed so far-fetched. The sun climbed higher, dull and pale through the fog, and Calvin returned to work. He leveraged his weight against the crowbar, feeling the resistant groan of ancient metal beneath his hands. One bolt gave, then another, wrenching free with sharp metallic snaps that rang out like gunfire. His arms trembled with exertion, but he pressed on, driven by a mix of exhaustion and relentless need to see this through. By late afternoon, 5 bolts had been freed, leaving only 2 at the base stubbornly fused in place. Calvin sat on the edge of the dock, panting, his muscles screaming in protest. He stared at the coffin, its lid slightly looser now but still sealed tight enough to deny entry. For the first time in years, he felt something stirring deep inside him, a sense of purpose, of quest. It was ridiculous, he knew, for a man his age to feel this kind of restless urgency, but it gripped him all the same. When he finally stood again, he fetched a lantern from his shed and lit it as the fog thickened once more. Night approached, the water blackening around him, the sky low and heavy with clouds. As the light of the lantern danced across the coffin's damp surface, he caught another detail he hadn't noticed before. faint decorative patterns etched along its sides, floral motifs interwoven with tiny, precise lines that spoke of craftsmanship far beyond the practical. This wasn't just a container for the dead. It was an object made with care, with intention, perhaps even reverence. He worked long into the night, illuminated by the glow of his lantern and the reflection of its light on the water. The sound of his tools echoed in the stillness, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the outer rocks. His thoughts wandered in time with his labor. He remembered the Navy, the long stretches of dark ocean broken by rare moments of fear or wonder, the camaraderie of men bound by salt and steel. He remembered the friends he'd buried, the flag-draped coffins, the sense of standing guard over something greater than himself. Now, in some strange way, this felt like a vigil of its own. By the time his strength failed him and he laid his tools aside, the lid was nearly free. Only the last bolt, fused almost seamlessly into the corroded rim, remained. He knelt there for a long moment, fingers resting on the cold, damp metal, feeling the strange finality of the moment pressing down upon him. Tomorrow, he thought. He would finish tomorrow. As he extinguished the lantern and trudged back toward his shack, the initials gleamed faintly in his mind's eye, and with them came a deepening curiosity. Whoever HCW had been, they had gone to the grave sealed in a coffin, built to defy time itself. Calvin couldn't shake the feeling that by prying it open, he wasn't just trespassing on the past, he was dragging it, unwilling and silent, into the present. When he lay down that night, muscles aching and hands stained with rust, the sound of the waves was different somehow, heavier, as though the sea itself waited for what he would do next. The morning was still and damp, the sky the pale color of old tin, when Calvin stood once again at the end of his dock. The coffin sat where he had left it, a silent, immovable sentinel. The fog had lifted slightly, but the air still smelled of salt and wet earth, the remnants of the storm clinging to the coast as if reluctant to let go. He rubbed the stiffness from his shoulders, the aches of the previous day still present in every muscle. His hands, roughened by years of hauling nets and saltwater labor, bore the reddish smudges of rust, marks of his relentless effort to free the ancient thing from its prison of bolts. Today, he told himself, it would open. He gathered his tools once more, setting them down neatly beside him. The crowbar, dulled and nicked from yesterday's work, felt heavy in his grip, but he welcomed the familiar strain in his arms. Kneeling, he inspected the final bolt, the stubborn piece of corroded iron that had defied him. Its head was nearly fused to the rim, a crust of salt and time sealing it tight. He reached for the grinder, flicking it on, the whine of the motor shattering the quiet of the cove. Sparks leapt into the gray air as the wheel bit into the bolt, metal hissing against metal, and the scent of scorched rust filled his nose. For nearly an hour, he worked in silence broken only by the steady grind, sweat dampening his collar despite the cool morning breeze. He thought of nothing else. His mind narrowed to a single focus, freeing the last barrier between him and whatever lay inside. At last, with one final strike of the mallet and a groaning protest of metal, the bolt surrendered. The sound was sharp and echoing, startling a pair of gulls into flight overhead. Calvin sat back on his heels, staring at the coffin, now unsealed for the first time in what must have been well over a century. He rested for a moment, drawing in deep breaths, the weight of what he was about to do settling heavily over him. His heart thudded in his chest as he gripped the crowbar once more and slid its tip beneath the lip of the lid. Slowly, carefully, he pried upward. The metal groaned like something alive, resisting until, with a jolt, it shifted. A faint rush of air escaped, stale and cold, carrying with it the dry scent of time long past. He froze, the crowbar trembling slightly in his hands, then pressed again, levering the lid upward inch by inch until it tilted enough for him to push it aside. It scraped loudly against the dock as it came to rest, exposing the interior at last. He leaned forward, holding his breath, expecting, though he hardly knew what, to see bones or worse. For an instant, his mind conjured grim visions of preserved remains, of hollow sockets staring back at him through the dimness. But instead, what met his gaze was something entirely different, something so impossible it stole his breath and left him frozen. Inside, beneath the faint haze of dust and age, lay no human form. Instead, a series of small, carefully arranged parcels and chests filled the space. Their shapes were tidy, deliberate, wrapped in layers of oilcloth and leather straps that had blackened with age, but somehow endured. A faint glimmer of metal caught the lantern light he had brought out, and he reached in with trembling hands to pull one closer. The cloth crumbled at his touch, disintegrating like brittle leaves, and beneath it was a chest no larger than a tackle box, its brass fittings tarnished but intact. He worked the clasp open, and as it creaked, the lid swung back to reveal a sight that made his pulse roar in his ears. Gold. Not merely coins, though there were stacks of them glinting faintly in the weak daylight, their surfaces stamped with intricate crests and dates from the mid-1800s. Nestled among them were nuggets and thin ingots, their color rich and deep, as if untouched by air for all these long years. His fingers, rough and work-worn, hesitated before brushing over them, almost disbelieving their reality. The next chest revealed strings of pearls coiled like serpents, necklaces studded with precious stones, rings heavy with ornate settings that spoke of another age entirely. There were silver chalices, their once polished surfaces dulled but unmistakably fine, and delicate brooches inlaid with tiny enamel flowers. Each piece was a relic, not just of wealth, but of craftsmanship unseen in modern times. As Calvin moved deeper into the coffin's contents, he uncovered rolled documents bound in ribbon, their parchment yellowed but legible. One bore a seal he recognized instantly from history books, a Confederate emblem. His hands trembled as he lifted it, breaking the brittle wax and unrolling the page. Written in lupin ink was a name he did not know, followed by references to safe passage, hidden cargo, and fund secured for transport. The words blurred before his eyes, not from age, but from the rush of disbelief overtaken him. Then, nestled among these relics, he found something that rooted him to the spot. A small locket, its chain broken but intact, rested in the corner, half buried beneath folded fabric that looked like remnants of a uniform sash. He picked it up gently, prying it open with his thumb. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of a woman, her expression serene, framed by hair in a style unmistakably Victorian. But it wasn't her face that froze him, it was the engraving on the reverse of the locket. To I.H., my steadfast hand in the storm. Calvin stared at the letters, his mouth dry. I.H., the initials matched his own surname. His grandfather had spoken often of an ancestor named Elijah Harper, a free man of color who had lived near the coast during the 19th century, rumored in family lore to have been both a sailor and a man who trafficked secrets for the desperate. Most in the family had dismissed those stories as little more than romantic invention, tales born of pride to give meaning to lives hardened by poverty and labor. But now, here was proof, tangible and irrefutable, locked away in a coffin pulled from the sea. He sat back, the locket cradled in his palm, his thoughts spinning wildly. The pieces began to align in his mind. The Confederate seal, the gold, the letters referencing transport. This was no ordinary burial. This coffin had been a vault, sealed tight against time and tide, carrying wealth and secrets from a turbulent era that had drowned in history. And somehow, impossibly, it connected to him. The sun was sinking by the time he emerged from his trance, painting the water with streaks of red and gold that mirrored the treasures before him. He glanced around the quiet cove, the solitude pressing in more keenly now. The world beyond this place felt impossibly far away, and for a moment he wondered if anyone would believe what he had found, or if he should even tell them. The sea lapped softly at the pilings beneath him, as though indifferent to the revelation it had yielded. Calvin stared into the open coffin, surrounded by wealth he could barely comprehend and history that felt far too close. He knew then that this discovery would not be simple. It was not just gold and jewels. It was a key, a door opening into a past he had never imagined touching, and the weight of it settled over him like a tide rising slowly but unstoppably. He closed the locket carefully and set it beside the chests. The initials HCW still gleamed faintly on the lid propped against the dock, a silent reminder of whoever had been meant to lie here. He wondered who they were, and whether they had known Elijah Harper, and how their fates had intertwined so completely that over a century later it would come to him, here in this lonely corner of the coast. As darkness deepened, Calvin covered the coffin loosely with an old tarp and secured it as best he could. His hands trembled as he tied the knots, his mind buzzing with questions he couldn't yet answer. He stood for a long time, staring out at the darkening horizon, the rhythmic sound of the tide filling the silence. He felt no triumph, only an odd, quiet sense of gravity, as though something vast and long buried had shifted beneath his feet. That night, sleep eluded him once more. The gold, the locket, the strange initials, they filled his thoughts, intertwining with his grandfather's stories until past and present blurred. He lay awake, listening to the ocean, wondering if in its endless depths there were countless more secrets like this, waiting for storms and chance to drag them ashore. And though he didn't yet know it, the discovery that had started with a storm and a solitary fisherman would draw him deeper, not only into a forgotten chapter of history, but into a reckoning with his own blood and legacy that would change him forever. The days that followed were not easy. Calvin Harper woke each morning to the same soft whisper of the tide brushing against the shore. But the world felt altered, subtly charged with something he couldn't define. The coffin, still hidden beneath the tarp at the end of the dock, became an anchor for his every thought. He went through the motions of his usual tasks, checking the crab traps, repairing the aging hull of his skiff, chopping wood for the stove, but all of it felt hollow, secondary to the quiet pull of the mystery he had uncovered. He was no longer simply a fisherman or a man living out his days in solitude. He had been handed a question by the ocean, and he knew he couldn't ignore it. The treasures inside the coffin remained untouched after that first day. Calvin had carefully rewrapped the chests in layers of canvas and stacked them in the back of his locked storage shed, out of sight from curious eyes, though no one had come by. The only item he kept with him was the locket, now resting in the top drawer of his nightstand. Each night before bed, he would hold it in his hand, tracing the faint engraving with his thumb, trying to picture the life of the man it had belonged to. I.H. Elijah Harper. The name sounded more real now than it ever had during the scattered family stories his grandfather used to tell. Calvin could still recall those slow, rhythmic evenings on the porch, the old man speaking in half-mumbled recollections about a great something who had done something important with a ship in the war and had vanished with secrets no one ever found. Most in the family had chalked it up to a fading mind or the wishful pride of a man who wanted to believe his people came from something more than hard labor and hunger. But now Calvin had the proof in his own weathered hands. It was late on the third morning after the discovery when he decided he needed to know more. The question of where the coffin had come from and how it had ended up beneath the waves gnawed at him. He had no desire to draw attention or to invite anyone to pry into what he'd found. But the truth mattered more than his instinct for privacy. This wasn't just a secret buried in the mud. It was something personal, something ancestral. He drove into town, the sun just beginning to burn off the haze that clung to the trees. The local library was small, housed in an old clapboard building near the center of the square, its roof patched in places and the front steps worn smooth by time. He hadn't been inside in years. The last time he'd come looking for information about old fishing routes, long before GPS made such things unnecessary. Now, as he stepped into the cool, dusty space, it felt almost like entering a sanctuary. The librarian was a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a soft voice. She greeted him politely, though he could tell she didn't quite remember him. He asked for old shipping records, newspapers from the 1860s, anything about Confederate ships or unusual cargo along the coast. She didn't ask questions, only nodded and led him to the back room where the archives were stored, unlocking a wooden cabinet with a heavy brass key. The next several hours passed in silence, broken only by the rustle of yellowed pages and the occasional creak of the wooden chair beneath him. He flipped through brittle issues of the Wilmington Journal, scanned ship manifests scrawled in looping script, and pored over maps that outlined the ever-shifting coastline. At first, it felt like looking for a needle in a salt flat. But then, just as the afternoon sun reached its apex, something caught his eye. An article from August 1864, printed in faded ink near the bottom of a page, detailed the presumed sinking of a Confederate ship named the Magnolia Belle. It had been traveling north along the coast, believed to be carrying high-ranking officers and funds intended to reach Richmond before the city fell. The piece was brief, speculative, noting that no survivors had been found, and no wreckage had ever been confirmed. But it named one passenger in particular as being of interest to authorities at the time. A free man of color identified as E. Harper, aged approximately 35, employed as a translator and navigator, traveling under military exemption. Calvin's breath caught. The name was there. Not a legend, not a half-remembered tale, but ink on paper. Elijah Harper. He sat back in the chair, the article trembling slightly in his hands. The implications were staggering. Not only had his ancestor been on board a secret Confederate ship, he had been trusted enough to be granted exemption from service and named in official dispatches. He remembered his grandfather once claiming Elijah had helped ferry messages between Union sympathizers and abolitionist circles, operating under the guise of neutrality while working toward freedom in the shadows. If the story were true, and this man had been the part of the Magnolia Belle's final voyage, then the contents of the coffin might not have been treasure intended for escape, but something more complex, more dangerous. He continued digging. A week's worth of reading followed over the next few days, each trip to the library yielding more clues. In a ledger from the port of Charleston, he found mention of cargo marked S-17, secured transport, personal and military effects, authorized EH. In a separate log, the same shipment was recorded as never having arrived at its destination. Then, a list of names from a Confederate officer's journal referenced the colored man Harper, noting that he had argued against sailing that night due to storms and tide, but had been overruled by command. The last line in the entry read simply, "He vanished with the sea." Calvin sat with that sentence for a long time. What if Elijah had known what was in the coffin? What if he had made a choice? To hide it, to protect it, to ensure it was never used for the cause it had been intended to support. The thought filled him with a strange pride. It would explain the presence of the locket, the careful wrapping of the treasures, the subtle defiance written in those brittle pages. Elijah might have been a smuggler of truths, not just gold. Back at home, Calvin reopened the coffin, this time with reverence. He examined the contents again, slower now, looking not for wealth, but for stories. He found a water-damaged journal, its pages almost unreadable, but one name kept appearing: Isabel, always paired with lines that suggested longing, remembrance, love. Perhaps she was the woman in the locket, or someone Elijah had known, a figure lost to time but preserved in ink and metal. As he read, he felt a connection deepening, not only to Elijah, but to a broader history, one that lived not in textbooks or museum plaques, but in the quiet resilience of men who did their work unseen, their courage unrecognized, their sacrifices unrecorded. The sun dipped low that evening, casting long golden bars across the shed floor. Calvin stood over the coffin one last time, then carefully replaced the lid and refastened the tarp. He would not forget what he had found. He couldn't. It wasn't just gold, it was legacy. It was proof that his blood came from something powerful, not in title or wealth, but in purpose. And still, he couldn't ignore a deeper question rising now, steady as the tide. What would he do with it? What did it mean to carry the weight of a story hidden for over a century? He did not yet know the answer, but he knew one thing with certainty. The past had found him, and it wasn't finished speaking. The quiet rhythm of Calvin's days began to fracture. He had always been a man of habit, his life dictated by the tide and the turn of the seasons. But now, each passing hour carried with it the weight of something unsaid, a pressure that pressed against him like the humid air before a storm. He had thought that keeping the discovery to himself would be simple. After all, who would come poking around the remote cove of an aging fisherman who kept to himself? Yet, even solitude had its cracks. In small towns, the smallest ripple could spread like a wave, and Calvin began to sense that the tide of attention was shifting toward him. It started innocently enough. At the general store one morning, as he stood near the counter buying coffee and rope, he noticed two men by the door talking in low voices. One of them, a wiry local named Jace Milner, glanced his way, his eyes sharp and lingering too long. Calvin had known Jace in passing for years, a man whose life seemed to orbit between odd jobs and trouble, always skirting the edges of respectability without ever quite touching it. When Calvin nodded in greeting, Jace gave him a smile too quick, too knowing, and Calvin felt his gut tighten. Later that day, as he sat on the porch cleaning his nets, he saw a pickup truck crawl past his house, moving slow enough for the driver to stare openly at the dock before pulling away without a word. It happened again the next day. Different truck, same slow roll. He told himself it was nothing, but deep down he knew it wasn't coincidence. Perhaps someone had seen him towing the coffin from the water. Perhaps someone had heard him asking questions at the library. Whatever the cause, curiosity was beginning to stir where he least wanted it. He tried to brush it off and focus on his work, but his mind was restless. Each evening, after securing the tarp over the coffin and double-checking the locks on his shed, he would sit inside his small kitchen staring at the locket on the table, the engraved initials glinting faintly in the light of a single lamp. He thought of Elijah Harper and wondered what choices his ancestor had faced, what dangers had stalked him when he decided to take whatever was in that coffin and bury it in the sea. Maybe Elijah, too, had known the feeling of eyes on his back, of secrets that could not be carried forever without drawing risk. On the fourth night, Calvin was jolted awake by the crunch of gravel outside. His heart slammed into his chest as he sat upright, the room still wrapped in darkness. He reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, sweeping its beam toward the window just in time to catch the faint glint of movement near the dock. He pulled on his boots and jacket in seconds, stepping silently across the creaking floorboards, every instinct sharpened by old training. Outside, the night air was cool and sharp, the moon obscured by clouds, and for a moment there was nothing but the soft hush of the tide. Then he saw it. A figure crouched by the shed, fumbling at the lock. Calvin moved like a shadow, years of naval discipline returning unbidden. He came up behind the man. Jace, he realized, before the intruder even registered his presence. Calvin's hand clamped down on his shoulder, spinning him around. Jace froze, eyes wide, caught like a boy stealing apples. There was a flicker of defiance there, but it was weak, all bluff and no courage. "What the hell are you doing?" Calvin's voice was low, steady, the kind of tone that once cut through chaos on rolling decks at sea. Jace stammered something about hearing rumors, about seeing old metal dragged from the water and figuring Calvin was holding out on everyone. His words reeked of greed thinly veiled as curiosity. Calvin could see it plainly, the kind of hunger that didn't care about history or legacy, only what could be pawned and sold for quick cash. Calvin tightened his grip and marched him back toward the gravel road, every step firm and silent. Jace cursed under his breath, but when Calvin leaned in close enough for him to hear the steel in his voice, promising that any return would be met with the sheriff, Jace went pale and muttered his retreat. When the pickup truck finally tore off down the road, taillights vanishing into darkness, Calvin stood there alone, breath steady, but adrenaline still thrumming through his veins. The incident settled it in his mind. Secrecy was no longer enough. Word had leaked, and sooner or later greed would bring others. He had to make a choice. He could hide the coffin forever, bury it deep, or sink it back into the sea, letting it vanish like it had before. Or he could bring it forward, tell the authorities, and trust that the law and the truth of Elijah Harper's story would guard it better than he could alone. But even as he weighed those options, another thought pressed in, quieter but relentless. What if he kept it? The gold alone could change his life forever. He could pay off his debts, repair his home, live out his remaining years without worry. No one else had any claim to it. Maritime salvage laws were clear enough. He was the one who had found it. He could argue that it was his by right. That night, he sat on his porch until the small hours, the locket in one hand and a cup of black coffee in the other. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, and he thought of the sea's long memory. Elijah had chosen to hide it, whatever his reasons had been, binding his fate and his fortune to silence. Now the burden had passed to him. By dawn, he knew he couldn't follow that path. Keeping it secret would mean living every day waiting for footsteps on his graveled drive, for prying eyes and whispered questions. It would mean dishonoring the man who had gone to such lengths to protect it in the first place. And yet, giving it up felt just as heavy, like cutting loose a piece of himself. He wasn't a man who asked for much in this life, but he wanted to be able to look in the mirror and see someone who still had a measure of integrity left. The next day, he called an old friend in town, a retired Coast Guard officer named Hank Wallace, who still held sway with the local authorities. He explained only that he had found something of historical value that needed to be properly assessed and secured. Hank, after some prodding and a promise of discretion, agreed to meet him the following evening. Calvin hung up the phone and stared at his hands, feeling both relief and a strange, hollow dread. That night, as he stood by the dock listening to the tide lap at the pilings, he caught sight of headlights again in the distance. They slowed near his property before moving on. The message was clear enough. Whatever he chose to do, he had to move quickly. The wind shifted inland, carrying the faint smell of rain, and Calvin Harper looked out over the dark water. The choice had been made. Tomorrow would bring answers or consequences, or perhaps both. All he could do now was face it like a man who had spent his life at sea, steady on his feet, eyes fixed forward, braced for whatever storm came next. The following evening arrived cloaked in an uneasy stillness, the kind that often preceded storms on the coast. Calvin spent the day pacing between the dock, the shed, and his porch, unable to focus on the simplest tasks. Every creak of wood, every distant hum of a passing truck tightened his shoulders. Hank Wallace was due to arrive just after sunset, bringing with him a trusted historian from the State University who specialized in Civil War maritime records. Calvin hoped that between Hank's connections and the historian's expertise, they could both validate the find and help him secure it from further intrusion. He told himself it was the right thing to do, but the nagging sense of exposure never left. As dusk crept in, streaking the sky in faded oranges and grays, Calvin locked up the shed once more and checked the tarp over the coffin. The rhythmic hush of the tide was almost soothing in its familiarity, but it couldn't mask the gnawing sense of danger he had carried since Jace's late-night trespass. He returned to the house, brewed a pot of coffee, and tried to quiet his restless thoughts. Yet, just as he lifted the cup to his lips, he heard it. The crunch of gravel outside, slow and deliberate. He moved to the window, peering through the narrow gap in the curtain. A pair of headlights cut across the yard, briefly illuminating the shed before flicking off. The truck door slammed, then another. His stomach dropped. He set the cup down silently, every motion measured. The habits ingrained in him during his years at sea came back without thought. Stay calm, assess, act. He slipped on his boots, reached for the heavy flashlight and the old Navy-issued utility knife he kept in the drawer by the door, and stepped out into the night. The air was damp and cool, carrying the scent of salt and pine. He kept to the shadows, moving along the side of the house, his ears straining. Low voices carried faintly from near the shed. 2 men, maybe 3. He recognized one as Jace, his drawl sharp even in whispers. Calvin crouched low, his heart steady now, every sense sharpened by the clarity of purpose. The men were trying the lock, their flashlights darting like fireflies across the boards of the shed. One of them cursed softly, metal clinking against metal. They had come prepared. Calvin circled wide through the darkness, his boots silent in the damp grass, until he reached the rear of the shed. He slipped between the pines, keeping low until he was close enough to see the glint of their tools in the dim light. He waited, timing his breath, and then stepped forward with the suddenness of a breaking wave. "Step away," he said, his voice low but carrying enough command to make them freeze. The 3 men spun, startled. Jace's flashlight beam hit him square in the chest before wobbling upward, revealing Calvin's expression, unflinching, jaw set, a silhouette carved in shadow and resolve. "What the hell are you doing, old man?" Jace blustered, but there was a tremor in his voice. "You know what you're doing," Calvin replied, stepping closer, his boot steady on the gravel. "And you know whose property you're standing on." The second man shifted uneasily, glancing between Jace and the locked shed. The third hung back, silent but tense, his hand flexing nervously around a crowbar. Jace sneered, though it was thinner now. "Words out, Calvin. You found something in that storm, didn't you? You don't get to keep it all to yourself." Calvin's gaze didn't waver. "You don't know what's in there. You don't know what it means." "We know enough," Jay shot back, stepping forward, puffing himself up. "A man like you living out here alone doesn't haul something out of the ocean just to lock it away for nothing. We figure whatever's in there's worth more than your quiet little life." The knife in Calvin's hand gleamed faintly as he angled it downward, not threatening but unmistakably present. He had no desire to hurt anyone, but the memory of too many nights standing his ground in places far harsher than this steadied his voice. "You're done," he said evenly. "Walk away now, and you won't see me again except across town. Stay, and I promise you'll regret every second of it." For a tense beat, the only sound was the lapping tide and the wind rustling through the pines. Then the second man stepped back, muttering something about this not being worth it. The third followed, lowering his crowbar and retreating to the truck. Jace lingered a moment longer, his jaw tight, but Calvin took another step forward, and something in his eyes must have convinced him. With a sharp curse, Jace turned and stalked off, slamming the truck door behind him. The engine roared to life, and gravel spat out from beneath the tires as they sped off into the night. Calvin exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders releasing by inches. He checked the lock on the shed, then returned to the house, every motion deliberate and slow, as though keeping pace with the pounding of his heart. He sat heavily at the kitchen table, staring at the dark window, listening to the fading echo of the truck. Not long after, Hank arrived in his old SUV, headlights sweeping across the yard before cutting off. Calvin greeted him at the door, explaining everything in terse detail. The coffin, the treasures, Elijah Harper, and now the trespassers. Hank listened quietly, his brow furrowed but not skeptical. After decades in service, Hank had heard stranger things and trusted Calvin enough not to doubt him. Together, they unlocked the shed, and Calvin revealed the coffin's contents. Hank's whistle was low and astonished, his flashlight beam gliding over gold and jewels that hadn't seen open air in over a century. "My God," he murmured. "Calvin, you weren't exaggerating." The historian arrived shortly after, a thin man with glasses and a sharp curiosity in his eyes. He handled the items reverently, muttering about provenance and preservation, already spinning threads of context and connection to the Civil War era. He confirmed what Calvin had suspected. The Confederate seal, the ship manifests he had uncovered in the library, even the style of the jewelry, all pointed to mid-19th century Southern elite. "You understand what you've got here," the historian said softly, closing the locket Calvin had shown him. "This isn't just treasure. This is history. Personal, regional, national. A find like this belongs in preservation, not locked in a shed." Calvin nodded slowly. He'd known this was coming, had made his peace with it, but hearing it out loud was different. Still, he felt no regret, only a quiet certainty. "I know," he said. "That's why I called." By the time they left that night, the plan was in motion. Arrangements would be made with the state's historical commission to document and secure the items, with Calvin listed as the legal discoverer. Under maritime salvage law, he would receive a substantial finder's share. More than enough to live comfortably, more than enough to fix the roof and retire his old debts. But beyond the money, it was something deeper. His ancestors' story would be told, preserved not as rumor whispered through generations, but written into history where it belonged. As he watched Hank's tail lights disappear down the road, Calvin stood for a long time beneath the moonlight, the breeze tugging gently at his jacket. He felt lighter, as if the weight he had been carrying since the storm had finally begun to shift. The ocean whispered behind him, steady and eternal, as though satisfied that one of its secrets had finally come home. The weeks that followed moved in a rhythm unlike anything Calvin had ever known. What began as a solitary discovery by an aging fisherman soon grew into something that reached far beyond his quiet stretch of coastline. The historians returned, bringing photographers, archivists, and specialists who cataloged every item with meticulous care. They spoke in low voices about preservation techniques, about funding for exhibitions, and about the extraordinary rarity of a find like his. Word spread in controlled circles first, official channels taken over quickly, but soon it spilled outward into whispers around town, then into the broader current of news that no man could stop. For the first time in his life, Calvin Harper found himself at the center of something larger than the boundaries of his dock and his worn-out skiff. The legal process was deliberate but straightforward. Maritime salvage law was clear enough, and after hearings and signatures that felt surreal in their formality, the state awarded him a 30% finder's fee based on the appraised value of the treasure. When the final tally came back, even Calvin, who had suspected its worth, was stunned. Over $2 million. His portion alone was more than he had ever imagined holding in a lifetime. He had lived frugally his entire adult life, content with enough to mend nets, keep his boat fueled, and put food on the table. Suddenly, he had the means not only to survive, but to rebuild everything around him. Yet it was not the money that anchored his thoughts most deeply. It was Elijah. The more the historians uncovered, the more the man took shape in his mind. Letters painstakingly translated revealed details about the voyage of the Magnolia Belle. Fragments of journals spoke of a plan to divert Confederate gold away from its intended use, to keep it from fueling the last desperate months of the war. Elijah's name appeared again and again, not as a subordinate, but as a trusted partner, one whose knowledge of the coast and ability to move unseen had been invaluable. The pieces fit together with startling clarity. Elijah Harper had been no mere deckhand or guide. He had been instrumental in stealing history from the hands of those who would have used it to prolong suffering. Calvin stood in the exhibit hall the day the artifacts were unveiled to a select group of press and scholars, surrounded by glass cases that gleamed beneath warm lights. The gold and jewels that once sat beneath a tarp in his shed now rested on velvet, labeled with precise lettering. The locket lay at the center, open to reveal the faded portrait, its inscription displayed beside it. To I.H., my steadfast hand in the storm. It drew murmurs from those who read it, but for Calvin it was more than curiosity. It was a bridge through time, a tangible link between him and the man whose blood ran in his veins. The director of the State Historical Commission approached him, clasping his shoulder warmly. "Mr. Harper, you've not only given us treasure," he said, his voice rich with admiration. "You've given us a story we'd nearly lost, Elijah Harper's name will be studied for years to come." Calvin nodded, the weight of it pressing into him. Not heavy, but steady, grounding. He felt pride, yes, but also a deep humility. Elijah had not lived to see his name honored or his actions understood. He had vanished beneath the waves with his secrets, and only chance, a storm, and a stubborn old fisherman had brought them back to light. With part of the funds he received, Calvin repaired his home, replacing the sagging roof and mending the dock that had weathered decades of salt and storms. But much of it he donated. He gave to the restoration of an old African-American cemetery nearby, one neglected for generations where the stones leaned and crumbled under vines. He funded a scholarship in Elijah Harper's name at the local community college, aimed at young men and women who came from nothing, as Elijah once had. And he sent a portion to a veterans support network, a quiet nod to the brothers he had served with, some of whom had been lost to seas not so different from the one that had carried Elijah's coffin. Life in town changed too. The people who once regarded him as a solitary figure now greeted him with warmth and respect. Even those who had once eyed his property with suspicion seemed to understand now that his discovery was something beyond greed. When he passed Jace Milner in town, there was no confrontation, only averted eyes and muttered silence. Calvin neither sought nor offered words. That chapter was closed. Yet, for all the new attention, Calvin's heart remained tied to the same routines. Each dawn, he still rose to the sound of gulls and the gentle slap of waves against pilings. He still took his skiff out past the breakers, casting his lines and letting the sea wrap around him with its familiar comfort. He no longer needed the catch to survive, but the act grounded him, reminded him of who he was long before the world had come calling. Some evenings, when the sky deepened into a wash of violet and the horizon blurred into shadow, he would sit at the end of the dock with a thermos of coffee and stare out at the Atlantic, listening to its endless murmur. He often thought of Elijah then. He imagined the man standing on a deck not unlike his own, scanning the same waters, wind pressing against his face. He pictured the determination it must have taken to risk everything, to steal away wealth intended for oppression and hide it in a coffin of iron and salt. Calvin found himself speaking aloud sometimes, quietly, as though Elijah might somehow hear him through the rolling surf. He thanked him, not only for the treasure, but for the reminder that history was more than names carved in stone or dates in books. It was flesh and blood, courage and sacrifice, passed forward through time in ways no one could predict. On the anniversary of the discovery, Calvin organized a small gathering at the cemetery where Elijah's new memorial stood. A polished granite marker bore his name, along with an inscription: Elijah Harper, navigator, patriot, and steadfast hand in the storm. Calvin stood with Hank and the historian, a few townsfolk, and even several of his distant relatives who had come down from farther north after learning of the connection. They laid flowers, spoke a few words, and in the quiet that followed, Calvin felt something settle inside him, as though a circle had finally closed. When he returned home that evening, he walked down to the water's edge one last time before nightfall. The tide was low, the sand damp beneath his boots, and the ocean stretched before him in its eternal motion. The wind was soft, carrying the smell of salt and pine, and for the first time in years he felt an almost unshakable calm. The past had not only found him, it had given him a path forward, a reason to rise each morning beyond the motions of survival. He looked out across the waves, the moonlight shimmering in broken lines upon the surface, and smiled faintly. Somewhere out there, he imagined, more secrets slept beneath the dark water, waiting for storms and chance to stir them loose. He had no need to find them. It was enough to know they existed, that the sea would keep its mysteries until the time was right. As he turned back toward his home, the dock silhouetted against the glow of his porch light, he felt lighter than he had in decades. What began as a lonely man pulling a relic from the tide had ended as a redemption, not only for Elijah Harper, but for himself. The sea had given him more than treasure. It had returned his family's story, his sense of belonging, and the knowledge that legacies, like tides, always find their way back to shore. And with that, Calvin Harper stepped into the quiet night, his heart steady, his mind clear, and the ocean's endless murmur following him home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video or explore our channel for more powerful stories. And if this moved you,